At 50,000 feet, silence becomes a weapon. No missiles, no escort, no radio chatter asking for permission. Just a single British jet sliding across the sky, calm and unbothered, while the most powerful air defense system on Earth scrambled beneath it. American radar operators saw the blip appear higher than anything they were used to tracking. Too high, too clean, too confident. At first they assumed it was a calibration error. Then the altitude numbers stabilized. The track didn't wobble. It didn't descend. It didn't accelerate. It simply existed, right where it shouldn't. Fighter squadrons were alerted. Pilots ran. Engines screamed. Interceptors clawed for altitude, burning fuel at a rate no peacetime mission justified. But the geometry was wrong. Every second the fighters climbed, the British aircraft stayed exactly where it was, already ahead, already untouchable. And the most unsettling part? The jet never reacted. No evasive turns, no speed changes, no sign the pilot even knew he was being chased. Later, in ready rooms across U.S. bases, pilots would argue about what they'd seen. Some claimed they were seconds from a lock. Others admitted quietly that they were never really in the fight at all. Official reports called it routine training variance. But unofficially, a far more dangerous idea spread through NATO airfields. Britain had built something America couldn't stop. And it wasn't even supposed to be a spy plane. To understand how this happened, you have to rewind to the early Cold War, when fear traveled faster than jets and altitude meant survival. The late 1940s and early 1950s were defined by one obsession: who could see first. Bombers were growing bigger. Interceptors were growing faster. Radar networks were expanding like nervous systems across continents. Everyone was preparing for a war they hoped would never come. But Britain was thinking differently. While the United States invested heavily in brute force, massive bomber fleets and layered air defenses, the Royal Air Force focused on something quieter: information. Knowing where the enemy was building, where aircraft were based, where missiles might one day stand ready. For that mission, Britain didn't design a radical new aircraft. They repurposed an existing one. The English Electric Canberra entered service in 1951 as a bomber. Twin-engine, straight-winged, subsonic. On paper, it looked unremarkable compared to the jets that would follow, but it had one trait that mattered more than speed or firepower. It could fly absurdly high, higher than most fighters could reach, higher than early radar systems were optimized to track, and it could do this without afterburners, without dramatic climbs, without drawing attention. The Canberra didn't announce itself. It simply appeared, already above you. British planners saw the opportunity immediately. Bomb bays were emptied. Cameras replaced explosives. Massive precision optical systems were installed, capable of photographing airfields, ports, and infrastructure from altitudes that made interception a mathematical nightmare. And the pilots chosen for these missions were trained with a counterintuitive rule: do nothing. No aggressive maneuvering, no evasive behavior, no reactions that might reveal intent. The Canberra's greatest defense wasn't speed or stealth, it was boredom. And soon, that boredom would begin humiliating American air defenses in ways no one was prepared to admit. But the most shocking encounters were still ahead, because once the United States realized what was happening, they tried to stop it. And failed. By the time American commanders realized the pattern, embarrassment had already set in. This wasn't a fluke. This wasn't bad weather, and it definitely wasn't luck. The same high-altitude track kept appearing during joint exercises and transit windows, always alone, always unarmed, always just out of reach. The Canberra didn't dart in and out like a spy. It didn't behave like an intruder. It behaved like it belonged there, which made it even harder to justify aggressive responses. That hesitation mattered, because intercepting a bomber was one thing. Intercepting an unarmed Allied aircraft flying a routine profile at extreme altitude was politically radioactive. Every scramble required approval. Every radar call had to be justified, and every delay worked in Britain's favor. When U.S. fighters finally did launch, the race was already lost. Early Cold War interceptors were designed for speed at medium altitude, not sustained climbs into the thin air above 45,000 feet. Pilots pushed their aircraft hard, afterburners lit, climb rates maxed, fuel gauges draining at alarming speed. But the Canberra didn't need to climb anymore. It was already there, cruising efficiently, engines relaxed, pilot steady. Altitude isn't just height, it's time. Time the interceptors didn't have. As American jets clawed upward, the Canberra continued forward, crossing radar sectors methodically. By the time fighters reached something close to interception altitude, the British aircraft was already slipping past the engagement window. No dogfight, no dramatic merge, just a quiet acknowledgement over the radio that contact was lost. Again. Inside U.S. command rooms, frustration grew. Radar operators replayed tapes, engineers recalibrated systems, pilots demanded answers. How could a subsonic aircraft, designed as a bomber, routinely outmaneuver purpose-built interceptors? The answer wasn't speed, it was doctrine. British reconnaissance doctrine was brutally disciplined. Canberra pilots flew pre-planned profiles calculated down to fuel burn, atmospheric conditions, and radar coverage gaps. They understood interception math better than the interceptors chasing them. They knew when a fighter could climb. They knew when it couldn't. And most importantly, they knew when not to react. Reaction created signatures. Signatures created urgency. Urgency triggered authority. So they gave none. The Canberra flew straight and level, presenting the least threatening picture possible. On radar, it looked boring, predictable, almost civilian. That illusion bought precious minutes, minutes that meant the difference between escape and interception. And then there was the altitude itself. At extreme heights, radar performance degraded. Returns weakened. Tracking accuracy dropped. Controllers struggled to generate reliable vectors for interceptors climbing through thinner air. Even when fighters approached the right altitude, their pilots faced another problem: energy. Fighters arrived exhausted. Low fuel, reduced maneuverability, engines operating at the edge of safe limits. Meanwhile, the Canberra pilot was calm, oxygen flowing, instruments steady, cameras rolling. And those cameras weren't just collecting images, they were collecting data, runway layouts, aircraft dispersal patterns, naval movements, infrastructure expansion, information that would quietly flow back into British and NATO planning rooms, shaping strategy without a single shot fired. Unofficially, U.S. pilots began to admit something unsettling. They weren't chasing the Canberra, they were being measured by it. And what the measurements revealed would soon force America to rethink how it defended its own airspace. Because once the truth became impossible to ignore, the response wasn't denial anymore. It was escalation. When denial stopped working, the United States did what it always did best. It built something new. Quietly at first, American analysts began dissecting every Canberra encounter. Radar logs were scrutinized. Climb profiles were plotted. Interceptor performance charts were marked with uncomfortable red circles. The conclusion was unavoidable. The problem wasn't pilot skill. It wasn't radar coverage. It was a gap in capability. The Canberra was exploiting a blind spot between altitude, endurance, and response time. So the U.S. Air Force shifted priorities. Interceptors were modified. New climb tactics were tested. Radar systems were tuned to search higher, longer, harder. And most importantly, a new category of aircraft began moving from concept to reality. Jets designed not to fight at altitude, but to live there. This was the birth of the high-altitude interceptor race. Aircraft like the F-86D and later the F-102 Delta Dagger were rushed into service, optimized for rapid climbs and missile-based engagements. On paper, they looked like the solution. Faster, higher, armed with guided weapons. The idea was simple: meet the Canberra where it lived and force it down. But the theory failed in practice, because altitude alone wasn't enough. Every time American fighters adapted, British planners adjusted. Canberra routes shifted, altitudes varied, timing changed. The reconnaissance missions remained maddeningly uneventful, and therefore effective. Even when interceptors got closer than before, the window was still too small. A few minutes of tracking, a few seconds of potential engagement. Then nothing. No shot taken, no warning issued, no incident logged. Officially, nothing happened. Unofficially, U.S. commanders were furious. The deeper issue was psychological. Interceptors were built to react, to chase, to threaten, to dominate. The Canberra refused to play that role. It didn't provoke. It didn't challenge. It simply observed. That restraint made it harder to justify escalation, especially against an ally. And Britain understood that dynamic perfectly. But the Canberra wasn't just flying over NATO airspace. It was flying much closer to the edge. In the mid-1950s, reconnaissance missions expanded beyond friendly exercises. Canberra variants began probing the periphery of Eastern Bloc territory, skirting Soviet radar coverage, mapping air defense responses, testing reactions. These flights were riskier, more aggressive, and far more valuable. The same traits that embarrassed American defenses now worried Washington. Because if Britain could do this to the United States, so could the Soviets. The irony was brutal. The Canberra, an aircraft born from post-war austerity and pragmatic engineering, was exposing vulnerabilities in the world's largest air force, and it was doing so without firing a single weapon. Then came the moment that changed everything. During one high-altitude transit, American interceptors came closer than ever before. Radar contact held longer. Vectors tightened. Pilots reported visual range conditions approaching. For the first time, the Canberra pilot adjusted course. Just slightly. Not evasive, not aggressive. Just enough to stretch the intercept geometry beyond feasibility. And once again, the fighters fell away. Fuel-starved, altitude-limited, defeated by math rather than maneuver. Inside U.S. briefing rooms, one question echoed louder than all the rest. If this aircraft was already obsolete on paper, what else were they missing? Because the Canberra wasn't the end of the story. It was the warning. And the next chapter would involve an aircraft that pushed this concept even further, one that forced the United States to rethink reconnaissance entirely. The Canberra's success created a problem no one wanted to say out loud. Britain had proven that altitude could defeat power, and once that lesson was learned, it couldn't be unlearned. Behind closed doors, American planners began asking a dangerous question. If an unarmed, subsonic British jet could roam this freely, what would happen if someone built a machine designed only for altitude and observation? The answer was already taking shape. The United States didn't copy the Canberra, but it absorbed its philosophy: absolute altitude, minimal signatures, no dogfights, no reactions, just patience and physics. That thinking would eventually produce the U-2, an aircraft so optimized for high-altitude reconnaissance that it initially seemed untouchable. But before the U-2 ever flew, the Canberra had already done the uncomfortable work. It exposed the illusion of control. Radar coverage looked comprehensive on maps. Interceptor readiness looked impressive in briefings. But real-world geometry told a harsher truth. Air defense systems were built around assumptions, and the Canberra quietly violated all of them. Even within NATO, the implications caused friction. American commanders disliked being outperformed by an ally. British officers, meanwhile, understood exactly how thin the margin was, and how easily pride could trigger overreaction. So missions were kept officially routine. Language in reports remained carefully neutral. Nothing about exploitation, nothing about exposure. Just training, just transit, just coincidence. But the intelligence gathered was anything but neutral. Every successful flight refined understanding of radar detection thresholds. Every delayed intercept revealed response times. Every exhausted fighter pilot confirmed endurance limits. The Canberra wasn't just collecting photographs, it was mapping the nervous system of modern air defense, and mapping it with remarkable safety. That safety emboldened planners. By the late 1950s, Canberra reconnaissance missions had become so normalized that their true purpose almost vanished behind procedure. Pilots flew with the confidence of people who knew exactly where the ceiling was and knew no one else could reach it in time. Until suddenly, someone did. Advances in missile technology changed the equation. Surface-to-air systems were improving faster than interceptors. Radar-guided missiles didn't care about fuel exhaustion or climb rates. They cared about detection, and once detection improved, altitude alone was no longer immunity. The lesson arrived violently in 1960 when a U-2 was shot down over Soviet territory. Overnight, the age of altitude invincibility ended, and that moment retroactively elevated the Canberra's legacy. Because unlike later reconnaissance platforms, the Canberra had operated during a brief, perfect window, when altitude was enough, when patience beat aggression, when restraint outperformed speed. Its success wasn't technological arrogance, it was timing. As missiles closed the sky, the Canberra faded quietly from the front lines. No dramatic final engagement, no official reckoning, just gradual replacement by newer systems, satellites, and faster aircraft. But inside aviation circles, its reputation hardened. The jet that embarrassed interceptors. The aircraft that taught America humility. The machine that proved air superiority wasn't always about dominance. Sometimes it was about being untouchable without anyone noticing. And yet, one final question lingered. Rarely asked, but deeply unsettling. If the Canberra could do this openly, what else was happening that never appeared on radar at all? Long after the Canberra stopped flying its quiet missions, the consequences refused to disappear. Because the damage it inflicted wasn't physical, it was conceptual. For decades, air defense had been built on a simple promise. If something entered your airspace, you would see it, track it, and stop it. The Canberra broke that promise in front of the people who believed it most. Not with stealth coatings or supersonic speed, but with discipline, altitude, and timing. American pilots who flew those failed intercepts carried the lesson forward. Many of them would later help shape the next generation of air defense doctrine. And almost universally, they agreed on one point. The Canberra wasn't fast. It wasn't invisible. It was simply ahead of its time. Its flights forced the U.S. Air Force to confront an uncomfortable reality. Air defense was reactive by nature, while reconnaissance could be proactive. Whoever dictated the terms of engagement, even passively, held the advantage. That realization rippled outward. Interceptor programs evolved. Radar networks grew denser. Missile systems multiplied. The margin that once protected the Canberra narrowed rapidly, but the core insight remained baked into aviation thinking. Control of altitude and information could neutralize raw power. This philosophy didn't die with the Canberra. It evolved. High-altitude reconnaissance gave way to satellites. Human pilots were replaced by sensors orbiting beyond reach. Later still, stealth aircraft adopted the same principle under a different form. Avoid reaction entirely. Don't trigger defenses. Don't provoke response. just pass through, unnoticed or unchallenged. The Canberra was the prototype mindset, and in that sense, it never really left the sky. What makes this story so striking is how little public attention it received. There were no press releases, no victory announcements, no dramatic footage. The most consequential flights were the least exciting to watch. Straight lines, steady altitude, silence on the radio. But inside planning rooms, those straight lines redrew maps. American air defense was not defeated. It was educated, and that education was expensive. By the time the U.S. fully closed the altitude gap, the world had already moved on to new domains. Space became the ultimate high ground. Information dominance replaced air superiority as the primary strategic currency. All of it traced back to a moment when a British jet, designed in the shadow of World War II, calmly exposed the limits of Cold War power. Not by challenging America, but by ignoring it. And that may be the most unsettling legacy of all. Because the most dangerous aircraft in history aren't always the ones that fight. They're the ones that fly through uncontested and leave everyone arguing afterward about whether they were ever truly there. Here's the part that still unsettles military historians. The Canberra didn't just succeed because of engineering. It succeeded because of restraint. In aviation, that's rare. Most aircraft are designed around escalation, speed to chase, weapons to threaten, maneuvers to dominate. The Canberra was built around denial of urgency, denial of justification, denial of reaction. It crossed airspace in a way that made commanders hesitate, pilots doubt, and systems question themselves. That hesitation was strategic gold. Because air defense doesn't fail all at once. It fails in moments, in delays, in uncertainty. Every Canberra flight forced American decision-makers into a dilemma: respond aggressively and risk political fallout, or respond cautiously and reveal weakness. Either choice benefited the aircraft already overhead. And that psychological edge mattered as much as altitude. Pilots who flew the Canberra later described the same surreal experience. They weren't tense, they weren't hunted, they were detached. Flying long, straight legs while knowing interceptors were burning fuel far below them, never close enough to matter. One pilot reportedly described it as watching a storm from above the clouds. That calm was contagious. It shaped how Britain viewed reconnaissance, not as an act of provocation, but as a form of quiet control. The aircraft didn't announce British power. It demonstrated British confidence. And confidence travels. Other nations noticed. Allies studied the profiles. Adversaries adjusted radar coverage. The Canberra forced everyone to adapt, even those Wapiu Ibgods, who never admitted it publicly. But history is unforgiving to advantages that rely on timing. As missile technology matured, the Canberra's protective bubble thinned. What altitude once guaranteed, radar and guidance systems slowly reclaimed. The sky grew smaller, less forgiving, more lethal. Yet even then, the Canberra avoided a dramatic end. No public shootdown, no televised crisis, no symbolic defeat. It exited relevance the same way it entered dominance, quietly. And that quiet exit preserved its myth. Because unlike aircraft that were destroyed to prove a point, the Canberra simply proved it and left. It forced change without suffering the consequences of being overtaken by it. Which brings us to the final irony. The Canberra is rarely mentioned alongside the U-2 SR-71 or modern stealth aircraft. It lacks glamour. It lacks cinematic moments. But strategically, it may have been just as important. It showed the world that air defense wasn't absolute. That power could be sidestepped. That sometimes, the most effective aircraft is the one no one can justify stopping. And that lesson still shapes aviation today, especially in an era where drones, satellites, and cyber systems follow the same logic. They don't fight you, they pass through you, and by the time you react, the mission is already over. One final question remains, one that ties this entire story together. If the Canberra exposed American air defense without ever being intercepted, what does that say about the threats we still don't see coming? The Canberra's final legacy isn't written in scrap metal or museum plaques. It's written in silence. Because after it flew, the rules changed, and no one ever admitted exactly why. Air defense systems grew more layered. Interceptor doctrines became more aggressive. Missiles replaced fighters as the primary guardians of altitude. Satellites took over the role Canberra pilots once performed alone in thin air. All of it framed as progress, none of it publicly tied to a quiet British jet that once crossed the sky without consequence. But make no mistake, the Canberra forced that evolution. It proved that dominance isn't always visible, that superiority doesn't always roar. Sometimes it drifts, steady, calm, unchallenged, while the world below scrambles and argues about what just happened. In an age obsessed with speed and spectacle, the Canberra embarrassed power through patience. It showed that the most dangerous aircraft isn't the one that wins the dogfight, but the one that never enters it. And that lesson still echoes. Modern stealth aircraft rely on the same principle. Avoid reaction. Don't provoke. Don't announce. Just exist where you're not supposed to be. Drones follow it. Satellites perfect it. Even cyber operations mirror it. Quiet access, minimal footprint, maximum insight. The Canberra was the first to do it in plain sight. That's what made it so uncomfortable. It didn't sneak. It didn't hide. It didn't fight. It flew and dared the world to stop it. And when the world couldn't, the myth of absolute air defense cracked. Today, the Canberra sits preserved in museums, polished and still. Visitors walk past it without realizing what it once represented. A bomber that became a spy, an ally that exposed a vulnerability, a machine that never fired a shot, yet forced an empire to rethink the sky. So the next time you hear about air superiority, interception zones, or impenetrable defenses, remember this story. Because once upon a time, a British jet designed in the 1940s crossed the Cold War sky alone, and nobody could touch it.